Over the last few decades, we've talked more and more about nostalgia and the way that it's taking over our culture. These days, it feels like everything is a sequel or a reboot or whatever this is.
Where am I?
What's up, Doc?
Look out!
Luckily, in this era of peak content, lovers of artfully crafted digital media can take heart. The advent of streaming means that there are more ways than ever for fresh work to be discovered, and for the cream to rise to the top. Or at least the top half. Imagine if, instead of this infinite library of great work, old and new alike, on demand at the click of a button, there were, like, 50 screens that could play movies. And now imagine they were all in the same city, and they each played one movie, once a day, for months, sometimes years. And then imagine that on top of it all, half of those 50 movies were remakes of old movies that had already been remade a bunch of times. And not A Star is Born remade, where each one has the same essential plot but they're otherwise quite different. No, we're talking beat for beat, word for word remakes of the original, with new actors and a more expensive coat of paint. Welcome to Broadway. Broadway as an industry relies heavily on the classic Broadway canon, a group of 100 or so shows which, while ranging in theme and tone, tend towards a similarly rose-tinted nostalgia for white, often American, hegemony. This makes progress difficult, especially since the target audience for said revivals are often people who remember the original and liked it how it was then. Even beyond an antiquated canon, though, Broadway has always been more interested in celebrating progress than actually facilitating it. For every producer willing to take a chance on a great production helmed by a non-white artist, there are 99 saying,
"Hey, let's do My Fair Lady again, but this time we'll throw a couple brown people into the ensemble and call it revolutionary."
This risk-averse majority, the 99, is what I call the Blob, a term lovingly pinched from the late great Stephen Sondheim's Merrily We Roll Along. The Blob is the establishment, the intellectual elite whose opinions are the status quo in any artistic medium turned industry.
And we're in their debt.
What do you think?
They tend to believe that art peaked around 25 years ago, and that anybody that disagrees just must not know better. Back when the Blob were also the church, the predominant method of such cultural control was prohibition. But we tend to frown on that these days. Besides, you don't have to be Ken Burns to know that prohibition is the best way to make something popular. The artistic output of a society is much easier to censor softly, with the ever-looming shadow of public opinion. If that doesn't work, the Blob may try to control the direction of a new movement, championing its most mainstream-friendly member and holding them up as proof of the meritocracy that they themselves are the impediment to.
See, says the Blob, we let in a weird one. Just the one we like, though. Who's really the good one? And since we have them, we certainly won't be needing any more.
This is the modus operandi of the Blob. The performance of progress in service of the status quo.
When they say hi gay, sashay into a deal today. We are sashaying into deals.
For decades, this performance would mostly involve feigning powerlessness.
We tried, it's just that audiences know what they like. And what they like simply happens to be exactly what we like. With people who look like us. Made by people we went to Sardi's with last Tuesday.
Only in the last few years have audiences' demands for representation in art gotten loud enough to require more from the Blob than lip service and tokenized inclusivity. But while increased scrutiny may require a more nuanced performance, the Blob's progressivism still remains generally hollow. On Broadway, what modicum of representation the Blob deems safe is overwhelmingly on stage. Most so-called diverse productions do little more than use bodies of color, still mostly interested in the alabaster vision of a creative team whose idea of diversity begins and ends with,
Oh, finally! I'm so sick of these politically correct snowflakes with their black Annies and their In the Heights. I can't wait to hear someone talk about how the Phantom is white. He's always been white, and how Norm Lewis is.
That's not what we're doing, Grandpa.
Huh.
Okay? Norm Lewis is a national treasure.
I'm going.
Wait, were you recording in here? What the? Let's start with a definition. Identity-blind casting is the act of casting a production with no consideration towards how the actor's real-life identity relates to that of the character. The idea is to cast entirely based on acting merit and who is best for the role. This is the kind of meritocratic decision-making that sounds like a good idea, but it isn't.
Not a meritocracy and not a good idea.
Yes.
Alright.
Talent, although often treated as measurable, is not a matter of objective fact. Certainly, there are ways in which one can argue for the efficacy of, in this case, an acting performance, and ways in which one could improve such a performance. But the conversation often centers around ideas of truth and realism, which are very subjective. For instance, I once saw a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at Shakespeare's Globe in London. It was presented in Shakespearean period costume, and at the intermission, the woman next to me turned and said, "Isn't it wonderful? It's so realistic." Is it?
I'm pretty sure we just watched the King of the Fairies prank his ex-wife by turning a guy's head into the head of a donkey and then making her fall in love with him with a magic flower? So, realism?
In all sorts of ways, real is never not subjective. On the topic of Shakespeare, let's talk about one of the most famous Shakespearean actors in history, Sir Laurence Olivier. I actually wrote my own little blurb to explain who Laurence Olivier was, but then I found this hilarious write-up from the Criterion collection of his Shakespeare movies, so I'm just gonna read that. It's worth it.
Dubbed the greatest actor of the 20th century, Sir Laurence Olivier, the classically trained and majestically handsome English theatre veteran and one-time co-director of London's Old Vic, first transplanted his passion for Shakespeare to the big screen in the 1940s, and in so doing, allowed Elizabethan verse to break free of its stage-bound origins.
I mean, seriously, did Laurence Olivier write that? What the... Okay, anyway.
By 1964, Olivier was already world famous for his portrayal of Shakespeare's best-known heroes on film. Henry V in 1944, Hamlet in 1948, and Richard III in 1955. He continued to play all manner of Shakespearean roles on stage, but by 1965, those remained his only Shakespearean screen credits. You can imagine the public's delight when it was announced that a film was to be made of a very well-reviewed Shakespeare production he had done in London just the year before. How exciting! What could go wrong? Oh.
Knows that thou art false as hell.
Oh, my lord, with whom? How am I false?
So, it's important to note that America and England have very different relationships to race, and the British relationship to blackface at the time was,
In 1958, a British light entertainment show was broadcast for the first time. It would run for 20 years and became one of the most popular shows ever made.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the Black and White Minstrel Show!
Yeah, that ran until 1978. Also, here's a picture of Michael Gambon as Othello in 1990. Yeah, that's Dumbledore in blackface. Sorry. America, on the other hand, had just passed the landmark Civil Rights Act months before the film of the production arrived across the pond in 1965. So yeah, not the best timing, Inez Robb of the New York Times summed up the feelings of most American critics when she said in her review,
I was certainly in tune with the gentleman sitting next to me, who kept asking, when does he sing Mammy?
Mammy, I'm not getting copyright claimed by a racist from 100 years ago. Go Google it, it's not fun. I would be remiss not to note that a very young Maggie Smith is maybe the best Desdemona I've ever seen, and it's a real shame this performance is so overshadowed by the rest of the film, because...
Sleep, good madam. What's the matter with my lord? With who? With my lord, madam.
Who is thy lord?
Why, he that is yours, sweet lady.
I have none, but do not talk to me, Amelia. I cannot weep, nor answer have I none but what should go by water. Prithee tonight lay on my bed our wedding sheets. Remember, and call thy husband hither.
Here is a change indeed.
You know she's 19 when they filmed this? 19. Unbelievable. Anyway, with an American reaction like that, you can imagine the film did not receive a single Oscar nomination. Oh. Wow. In fact, the Academy were not even the only high-profile American defenders of the film. Pauline Kael, widely considered one of the 20th century's greatest film critics, considered Olivier's to be a better Othello than any she had ever seen, including Paul Robeson, the first black man to play Othello on Broadway in a mixed cast.
Part of the pleasure of the performance is, of course, the sheer feat of Olivier's transforming himself into a Negro. Yet, it is not wasted effort, not mere exhibitionism or actor's vanity. For what Negro actor at this stage in the world's history could dare bring to the role the effrontery that Olivier does? And which Negro actor could give it this reading? I saw Paul Robeson, and he was not black as Olivier is. Possibly Negro actors need to sharpen themselves on white roles before they can play a Negro. It is not enough to be. For great drama, it is the awareness that is everything.
This is a common idea among critics, practitioners, and viewers of drama, that, as Kael puts it, it is not enough to be. By this, they mean that being inherently right for the part, sharing physical identifiers and personal traits with the character as written, should be the last thing considered when casting a role. It is more important, they say, for the actor to embody the role, to be the truest realization of that character.
But what does it mean to embody a role? Again, the nuances of acting talent are subjective, as are concepts of truth and realism. Similarly, the idea of right for the role is easily tainted by all manner of subconscious and conscious biases, and usually results in the reinforcement of those biases onto an audience.
To Pauline Kael, by her own admission, Olivier was the best Othello because he was the most like her idea of blackness. While to a modern viewer, or indeed a more progressive contemporary like Inez Robb, his Othello is a violent, minstrel-inspired caricature bereft of any of the nuance with which the text is imbued.
What's this spare paper? This most goodly book made to write hard upon?
It's not that Kael lost her touch and stopped understanding how to judge a performance, but rather that she trusted her judgment so implicitly without questioning its source. What she did not recognize, at least in this review, is that one's conception of a character, and therefore what constitutes an actor embodying that character, is irrevocably linked to one's perception of people like that character. Many 20th century American approaches to Othello have tried to remove race from the play as much as possible. From James Earl Jones, who famously considered the role totally removed from race, to Patrick Stewart's infamous race-swapped production, to David Oyelowo, who went so far as to remove all reference to Othello's race from the play. But the racial issues of this play from a modern context are not reserved to the racial makeup of its cast of characters. They are inherent in the text itself. Although Othello is nominally the play's protagonist, the audience does not feel connected to him the way we do Hamlet, or even Richard III. They talk directly to us, more than any other character in their plays, and even when we don't agree with them, we share their point of view, tending to learn of new developments as they do.
Whether was done lead me. Speak. I'll go no further.
Conversely, in Othello, Shakespeare makes Iago the character who talks to us and knows what we know, creating the feeling that the audience is complicit in his eventual treachery. However, Ayanna Thompson, Regents Professor of English and Director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at Arizona State University, argues that this engenders a vein of racism that permeates the entire text.
I don't know exactly how it happened. At some point, I became the Othello whisperer. So when black actors encounter the role, and they start to have problems with the role, I get called in by the theater companies or the directors or the actors, and I talk them through why they might be experiencing what they're experiencing, and I tell them this. I should actually bring this PowerPoint with me from now. What you're feeling is not unique.
According to Thompson, most modern actors playing Othello run into the same problem. Since Iago is the only character who directly addresses the audience, and theater audiences tend to be majority white, the fact that the play sets us up to be on Iago's side can ricochet, and affect more than intended. Here's Thompson telling the story of working with the brilliant Adrian Lester, and his experience playing Othello.
So this is Adrian Lester in the 2013 production at the National Theatre in London. I was asked to interview Lester in the middle of the run, and he was incredibly generous, and we spent 3 hours together. And I said, how are you doing? Because at this point I'd already, I'd done my kind of Othello whisperer thing, so I was wondering how he was feeling kind of emotionally. He's like, I feel great, this is a great role. And I was like, oh, okay, tell me about it. And he said, well, this production is all about a military experience. So you can see this is set in 21st century military setting. It looks vaguely like some outpost in Iraq. And he said, we brought in a general who has been on set to talk to us about post-traumatic stress disorder. And really this is about what happens with men in a war setting and their relationships with each other.
In a very early meeting that I had with Nick, I said it would be great if we don't make Othello isolated on stage, because people think that if you are racially isolated, then you're isolated. Othello's West African. He can still be isolated and still have black people around him. Let's actually do a 21st century version of this play, and let's make it about character, and let's make sure we, above all, look at that.
And I was like, great, so you're feeling fine. And he's like, yeah, I feel totally fine. Okay, so good. 2 years later, Adrian and I were asked to do a dialogue together at an event like this, slightly larger, at the Royal Shakespeare Company. It was the World Shakespeare Congress. And we had a nice conversation. And then about halfway through, I was like, so do you want to talk about Othello at all? And he paused and he goes, I hated that fucking show. And I was like, wait, what? He goes, every night I looked out into that white audience and I could tell they were laughing at me, and they wanted me to be tricked by Iago, and they wanted me to kill Desdemona, and they wanted to laugh at me at my expense, and my soul died every night that I looked into the sea of white faces mockingly. And I was like, but when we talked in 2013, you were like, it's a military experience. And he said, that was the lie I had to tell myself every night to survive. He goes, I would not have survived the production otherwise.
In the play, race is simply a tool that Iago uses to manipulate. It's no more than that.
And that, in a nutshell, is why identity-blind casting fails. Because nobody is blind to identity. A production may remove race from the equation in theory, but in practice, neither artist nor audience gets to make that decision. We will always project societal ideas about race onto the production by virtue of living in a society indelibly stained by the history of colonialism. If created in a medium that uses human bodies, and presented to an audience that exists within a post-colonial society, every creation becomes about race in some way.
Even a classic play that is considered timeless or not about race, like Hamlet or Antigone, must contend at least somewhat with race when performed in a country like America.
And if the text is explicitly about America, well.
Experimental theater director Daniel Fish's production of Oklahoma, workshopped in 2015 at Bard College, first premiered. God damn it. It was the tip. It was the hat tip. Premiered at St. Anne's Warehouse in 2017, before transferring to Broadway in 2019.
I'm wearing flip-flops. Okay. Based on Lynn Riggs' 1931 play Green Grow the Lilacs, the musical is set in an unnamed town in 1906 Oklahoma, and tells the story of two love triangles and their eventual fallout.
When I'm with a feller, I forget.
One is played mostly comedically, with the ditzy horndog Ado Annie being pursued by Will Parker, a big lug with a heart of gold, and Allie Hackham, a traveling peddler from Persia. Persia.
My tricks gonna work, gonna make more than
Persia. The other love triangle is treated more seriously, with Lori, the most beautiful girl in town, being pursued by hunky cowboy Curly and creepy farmhand Judd. This rivalry ultimately culminates in a violent struggle between the two men, ending with Judd's death. Directly after this, in an unofficial trial, Curly is exonerated by the town judge, and he and Lori go off on their honeymoon.
Daniel Fish's production was performed with a much smaller cast than is usually asked for by the script, and contained several examples of modernistic staging, most notably the use of a live camera feed during Pore Jud is Dead, and a surreal take on the Dream Ballet. The orchestrations were retooled for a small band, and cornbread and chili made on stage in the first act were served at intermission. All of this could have added up to a fun, engaging revival of the show. But this production was not content with fun and engaging. This production wanted to say something. So let's explore what.
Fish seemed to want to tackle the issue of justice, exploring the community's complicity in the enactment of unjust rulings. One of the first things an audience notices is that the walls around them are lined with guns, long the symbol of America's fraught relationship with freedom and power. In theory, this sounds great, right? Any unbiased consideration of the history of this country would recognize it as a history of injustice.
And then they cast it. And they cast it race blind. Can we go back to the beginning of this section for a second? You remember when I said,
set in an unnamed town in 1906 Oklahoma?
Right. And then remember just now when I said, and they cast it race blind. Right. So,
for those of you who don't know, Oklahoma is actually a state in America. And America, especially in the early 1900s, but also just, America, is, not race blind.
Again, it's not that it was bad. The cast was excellent, the production was stylish. Heck, I even heard the chili was pretty good. But while this cast may have been literally diverse, the production was uninterested in the effect of casting non-white actors to play roles with implicit whiteness built in.
In a modern production of a classic play, this might be a kind of reclamation, questioning whether the expected whiteness of a character is merely the result of centuries of white actors playing a role whose humanity is in fact universally recognizable.
But a thoughtful critique of American justice is one that considers, perhaps centers, race, not one that ignores it. And the failure to explore this angle can result in, at best, a litany of missed opportunities.
Take, for instance, Lori, played by a black woman, Rebecca Naomi Jones, and her aunt Eller, played by a white woman, Mary Testa. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's unrealistic for a white woman to have a black niece. I don't care. We're also not in Oklahoma, and that's not the sun, it's a system of par lamps. Theater is, by its nature, unrealistic.
What I will say is that Laurie's blackness is, at most, incidental in this version of the show. In theory, Laurie being cast as a black woman could have been elaborated on in all sorts of interesting ways. What does it mean to be the only black woman in a 1900s Oklahoma town? How does it affect her relationships, and her connection to a similarly isolated character like Jud? What does it mean for Curly that he is in love with a black woman in the early 1900s? A song like People Will Say We're in Love, once a frothy, teasing back and forth, could take on all sorts of new meaning if presented as an exploration of hiding an interracial relationship. In theory. In practice, it made no real difference to either the reality of the play or the meta-context of the production, and any subliminal meaning added by the casting should be attributed to the actor playing her or the audience member viewing her. Laurie was written for a white actress, and in this production, she remained white in all but skin pigment. This is barely diversity. This is just rainbow whiteness. Compare Jones's treatment by the production to its treatment of its breakout star, Ali Stroker, whose portrayal of Ado Annie led her to become the first wheelchair user to win a Tony Award. In the original runs of the show at Bard College in 2007 and 2015, an able-bodied actress played the part, and did not use a wheelchair. The addition of the wheelchair was born solely out of what we can assume was a killer audition on Stroker's part, and its organic and unplanned inclusion led to exactly the kind of active engagement with identity that was missing in the production's approach to race. With their treatment of the role already conceived, they were forced to let it evolve naturally with the actor. Rather than ignoring her differences from the character as written, they left space for her to furnish the performance with her lived experience as needed, allowing Stroker to find the rounded, lived-in characterization that won her a Tony. The difference, of course, is one of logistical necessity. Stroker's identity as a person in a wheelchair is actively relevant to her role as an actor on a stage, but Jones's identity as a black woman, while not invisible, does not require tangible changes on the part of the creative team, and so is more easily left out of consideration artistically. But, as Stroker shows, conscious casting gives actors the chance to complicate characters with their own experiences. This is why I hate that term creative team. Actors are creatives too, and their discoveries can be just as valuable as any other. But as much of a shame as these kinds of missed opportunities might be, they're not the thing that makes identity-blind casting such a fatal mistake for a production. No, sometimes a production gets too close to saying something real and ends up saying something real dumb.
Let's get deeper into Jud's storyline. As a reminder, Jud is the creepy farmhand who's in love with Laurie. He's characterized in the text as being hardworking, quiet, and moody, and living in a small dark shack with dirty pictures on the walls. He's grimy and unkempt, an awkward, rage-filled guy who doesn't take good care of himself, desperately in love with the only woman who has ever shown him affection.
Since the text leaves it somewhat ambiguous, there is a key choice a director has to make about Jud, and how their production views him. Is he a creepy, alcoholic brute with a violent streak? Or is he an awkward, love-struck oaf, driven to madness by an uncaring world? To what extent does their production sympathize with Jud?
Throughout Act 1, Jud is creepy and a little obsessive over Laurie, but is also constantly being picked on by his love rival Curly, who literally sings an entire song about how everybody would like him better if he killed himself. No, seriously, that's what this song is about.
Poor Jud is dead. Poor Jud Fry is dead. His friends will weep and wail for miles around. Miles around. The daisies in the dell.
Basically, by the end of Act 1, he's still Schrodinger's Jud. He could go either way.
After the box social, in which Jud...
So I just realized nobody's gonna know what a box social is. So, a box social is basically like an auction where people bid money to win the chance to go on a date with someone, and the money goes to charity. It's basically this scene from Groundhog Day, but with girls.
Anybody? 75 cents.
I bet 2 bets.
Sold the lady for 25 cents.
I got him!
After the box social, in which Jud loses the auction for Laurie's hamper to Curly, there's a party. Mixed-up couples are dancing across the stage, and Jud and Laurie are one of them. As the others dance off stage, Jud stops. He wants to know why Laurie is never around him alone. She tries to evade the question, but he is undeterred, saying that she's all he can think about.
When I was sick, you brought me that hot soup out to the smokehouse and gave it to me. And me in bed. You hadn't shaved in 2 days. You asked me if I had any fever. You put your hand on my head to see.
Yeah, I remember.
Do you? Bet you don't remember as much as me. See, I remember everything you ever done, every word you ever said. Can't think of nothing else. See? See how it is?
In the text, the stage direction at the climax of this exchange is, he attempts to hold her, she pushes him away. The vagueness in this direction, and in the scene as a whole, forces a production to make their choice about Jud at this moment. Though some characterize it as a vain attempt at romance that Laurie gently rejects, embarrassing the awkward Jud, most use it as a moment to turn us against Jud, once and for all.
You always see who's better, Miss Laurie. And you wish you weren't so free with your ears. You're such a fine lady.
Are you making threats to me? Are you standing there trying to tell me if I don't allow you to slobber over me like a hog?
It's not that there's a particular correct choice, but merely that a choice must be made at this moment. Jud's death in the final scene is similarly underspecified by the script. In the text, he drunkenly crashes Laurie and Curly's wedding with a knife.
Wedding party's still going on? Woo! Glad it ain't too late. Got a present for the groom. But, first I want to kiss the bride.
When he lunges for Laurie, Curly stops him. And in the resulting tussle, Jud falls on his knife.
No, Jud! Look at him, he fell on his own knife.
It's a strange moment, especially followed as it is by the rest of the town almost immediately exonerating Curly with no trial, and ending the show with a bombastic reprise of the title song, but the unease of that juxtaposition is usually implicit at most.
Laugh all you like, but as a federal marshal... Oh, shut up about being marshal. We ain't going to let you send a boy to jail on his wedding night. We just ain't going to let you.
Again, if Jud has been a violent, drunken brute, this is a fitting comeuppance for an unrepentant villain. But also again, if you've allowed the audience to sympathize with him, this can be presented as the tragic end of a lonely man doomed from the start by an uncaring society.
The floor creaks, the door squeaks, there's a few...
So, Jud can go either way, but a production does have to make a choice. Right?
In Daniel Fish's production, Jud was played by Patrick Vale, an ashen, wiry actor styled with long, greasy locks and unkempt facial hair. Vale is a younger actor than usually plays Jud, and this, coupled with his styling, is pretty clear modern shorthand. This Jud is an incel, a sexually frustrated shut-in, bursting with rage at the world around him.
Ooh. It's a clever and subtle use of anachronism, recontextualizing the character of the angry, lonely crank for a modern audience. It recognizes that what was once an older man with a bottle is now a younger man with a keyboard. With just the information of this casting choice, one might think that the moral of this production of Oklahoma could be, the malignant forces of the past have not vanished, they have only mutated. That would be a great moral, and an especially timely one in 2017, but even if that was the moral intended by Vale's casting as Jud, it was not the one delivered. The end of this production is where Fish takes the most liberties with the script. When Jud crashes Curly and Laurie's wedding with the line, "Got a present for the groom, but first I want to kiss the bride," Curly looks irritated, but for some reason just sort of lets him? Jud walks over to Laurie, who stands still as he strokes her cheek and then leans in for a passionate, strangely not one-sided kiss. After the kiss, Jud places a gun in Curly's hand, cocking it before walking a few paces away. Standing across from the married couple, he is suddenly shot point blank by Curly. The bride and groom's white clothes are now blood-soaked, and their faces blank and horrified. The scene that follows out plays with cold and deliberate slowness, as the townspeople agree not to report the murder, and instead to let Curly and Laurie go on their honeymoon. The final reprise of the title song is sung out towards the audience, with the company's backs to the deed, fear and horror in their eyes. "Look what we've done," they seem to say. "Look what you've done." It's a very affecting ending to the piece, one that blames the whole town for its complicity in Jud's murder, and seems almost to blame us, the audience, as well.
It is an indictment of America's biased criminal justice system and the way it and we treat people perceived as different, and at the same time, it questions the validity of our love for this all-American couple getting married at the end, literally drenching them in the blood of the man whose fate they sealed.
Except, of course, it doesn't do any of that, because it was cast race-blind.
This production recognizes the immediate dramatic effectiveness of splattering a pair of newlyweds in the blood of an outcast, but seems uninterested in the outcome of such a choice on the overall piece.
Curly and Laurie are clearly coded as the quintessential American couple, the embodiment of a populace caught between the promise of a new world and the stains of an old one. But they're cast as an interracial couple in early 20th century Oklahoma. How can they be presented as this perfect all-American wedding cake topper couple when we in the audience know they'll be lucky if they live to see their own marriage made legal? How can they be the definition of a status quo to which their existence is anathema?
In its effort to be colorblind, or refusal not to be, it implies that American injustice is a race-neutral concept, which it very much is not.
To put it bluntly, the blood that stains America's wedding dress is not the blood of a misunderstood white man, and the woman wearing it is not a complicit black woman. If you want to make a point about a country, you cannot ignore major parts of its societal and historical context. You just can't.
Similarly contradictory is Fish's setup of Jud. Clearly the production wants to present him as a sympathetic character, the way it shines a light on the cruelty of Curly's treatment of him, and emphasizes his isolation from the rest of the town. This works for the first half of the production, until that scene with Jud and Laurie alone that we discussed earlier.
Remember, the stage direction just says he attempts to hold her, she pushes him away. Fish begins this scene in the dark, with only the sound of sloppy kisses and heavy petting heard over the speakers. Then, the clink of a metal belt buckle, and an abrupt end to the kissing. When the lights come up, Laurie fires Jud and is left alone on stage, crying and clearly distraught. Curly comes to find her, and she clutches him tight, stunned as the lights fade. There's not many successful pieces, in any medium, that attempt to sympathize with a would-be rapist. But the ones that do are those that understand the amount of work involved in earning back an audience's compassion after such a brutal, unforgivable transgression. Again, this production wants the immediate shock of the violation, but won't take responsibility for its aftermath. In one article on the production, Fish is quoted as calling Jud a person who's turned into an outsider by the community, and that he couldn't find anything in the text to make him think that Jud was a villain. Again, this is a potentially interesting reading of the play, but then why add an attempted rape? The only way I can imagine an audience maintaining sympathy for Jud after the rape is if he were like Lenny in Of Mice and Men, and literally didn't know what he was doing beyond the impulse to do it. But he's not. He's lucid, he's intelligent, and in this production that considers him the victim, he's a rapist. It's not that there's a particular right racial makeup for a production of Oklahoma, or any play for that matter, but rather that a production's unwillingness to engage with the realities of its audience, in this case, that audience's perceptions of race, is at best a cop-out, and at worst, can actively detract from the production's stated purpose.
In this instance, a production that wanted to unpack the uncomfortable aspects of a piece of classical Americana ended up sympathizing with the angry, sexually frustrated young white man brandishing a weapon at a public event, and blaming his death as much on the lone woman of color on stage as the white man who shot him and the white power structure that looked the other way.
The point is not that every casting choice has to be given some underlying societal meaning. It's that it already has one, regardless. And that returns us to the central issue of race-blind casting, and indeed of many uncontrolled elements of a production that uses human bodies. Sure, chance may have the potential to create unexpected moments of resonance, but such moments have the potential to resonate in ways counter to the production's goals. To leave such things entirely to chance is an indulgence that an incisive piece of political art can't really afford. To paraphrase Oscar Hammerstein II, with art, it's all or nothing. Now, listen, I can't tell you what went wrong here. How a progressive reimagining of a musical from the 1940s ended up being about how we should be nicer to school shooters even if they're rapists. But as you might have guessed, I do have a theory. As I mentioned at the beginning of this essay, Broadway, like so many modern industries and corporations, repeatedly performs progress without making any, paying lip service to the sensitivity with which we are telling this story, or the importance of uplifting voices and affirming marginalized identities. And, just like those industries, the power structure of Broadway is fundamentally biased towards white people. To begin, of the 41 theaters considered on Broadway, all of them are owned and managed by white people.
If you're talking about systemic change, you need to recognize that the most influential system on Broadway is just 3 men: Jordan Roth, Bob Wankel, and Jimmy Niederlander. They decide what gets to be a Broadway show and who gets to be a Broadway producer. So you're really talking about moving the needle on 3 individuals.
One rung down, producers of color continue to be incredibly rare. Like, single figures rare.
At the Tonys, legendary black producer-director George C. Wolfe is around 1/3 of all black directing nominees, and at least 1/4 of all black producing nominees. A black playwright has only won the Tony for Best Play twice. There is literally only one black person who has ever been nominated for either lighting design category. One. Either. Nominated. Ever! The vast majority of theater jobs go to white people, especially those offstage. Notably, in the last season analyzed, 80% of all writers and 94% of all directors were white. As I left the theater after seeing Oklahoma in 2019, my first thought was, why did nobody stop them? That sounds so much harsher than I mean it to. I just mean, like, how did a production this good end up this way? It didn't take me too long to come up with my thesis, nor much longer to confirm it upon getting home. Every single person on this creative team, a team creating a socially progressive production of a show about an unnamed Oklahoma town in the early 1900s, was white. To be clear, it's not like I think white theater directors can't be educated about race. I mean, I'm a white theater director, and oh, thank you. I wasn't fishing for that, I really wasn't. Nor do I think that a lighting engineer or a stage manager should be responsible for the racial dramaturgy of a production just by virtue of being a POC.
Clearly, a better option would be to hire non-white people in leadership positions, as well as a better dramaturg. Part of a dramaturg's job, after all, especially in a production trying to say something about America, should be expressly to consider the racial dynamics of... Wait, What? You didn't even have a dramaturg?
Daniel! Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! The whole time you would... The whole time!
I mean... maybe dramaturgs were just too expensive?
I have to go. We have to leave now. I have to leave. We have to leave now. I have to go. We're going.
That notwithstanding, having any black people anywhere in the entire creative team, it would have done something. Heck, even involving the actors earlier and more in the creative process might have bridged that gap somewhat. Remember, actors are creatives too, and their diversity is not just physical. Engaging with their experience is exactly what takes a production from diversity to representation, and representation is what this production was missing. Having a black voice in the creative team might have helped them recognize that, for instance, depictions of gun violence in 21st century American art bring to mind either domestic terrorism or police shootings, both of which are irrevocably linked to race. Or made them contend with the idea that one of the two black actors in the ensemble plays the sheriff of a 1906 Oklahoma town, and the implications that would have in such a place even today.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
These are not ideas that need degrees and piles of books to understand. This is the bare minimum, the context without which a piece of art inevitably becomes unmoored and floats away from its intended purpose, like Sandra Bullock in that movie I hated. Fuck that movie, by the way. Oh, she's floating. Oh, you see how she's a little fetus? Get it? No, I don't actually. What am I... Is she being reborn? Like the kid she killed? Didn't her daughter die or something? Isn't that the point of that movie? Near the beginning of the pandemic, a letter called Dear White American Theater, signed by over 300 artists of color, began making the rounds on the internet. It called out the systemic issues with the industry, the bigotry and bias, conscious and subconscious. It's a great letter, and I encourage everyone to check it out, as well as their longer list of demands. The Blob's reaction to these documents was predictable. Some started diversity committees, others hired diversity consultancy firms, while others still hired full-time inclusivity directors. But it seems like this has had little effect on mainstream theaters beyond the addition of a new section to their websites. A recent post on the website onstageblog.com exemplifies the tyranny of the Blob, anonymously detailing the experience of a black woman currently serving as Director of Inclusion and Diversity for a large theater organization. I was told that I would be given the lead on planning and executing initiatives that would promote diversity and inclusion and be the first contact for anyone who had issues with discrimination or harassment. A little over a year after I started my first day, none of that has happened. Instead, my ideas have been initially embraced, but then nothing materializes because the leadership at this organization doesn't seem to want to follow through. The list of excuses for not allowing me to do my job seems to be just as creative as the production value of our show. It's almost as if my hiring was enough for them to say, "Look, we embrace diversity. We hired someone to take care of it." To me, this lazy over-reliance on the comfortable, it's almost worse than the outright bigotry that it claims to have replaced. I mean, at least bigotry implies conviction. The simple fact is that diversity provably works. Diversity not only creates stronger communities, but also better teams. Teams which have been shown to work both more efficiently and more creatively. In terms of art making, more representation means viewing the work from more angles, finding new answers to old questions, and ultimately creating a piece that holds more dimensions for more people. Sometimes this may mean less early consensus, and a less efficient start to the process, but everybody agreeing on a creative team isn't always the best thing. Sometimes, granted, it means that we're all on this crazy wavelength together, man, and we're all just free radicals, just sticking it to the system, bro. And most of the time, it's because we're doing something that we all know is supposed to look a certain way. More often than not, it belies a comfortable stagnancy, a shared blobification of the kind that leads every production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf to look the same as the one 2 months earlier, but with new upholstery. If mainstream theater wants to survive being swallowed up by the era of peak content, it needs to reclaim its status as the center for radical innovation that set it apart from other dramatic media well into the 20th century. Revivals need to commit to asking all the questions we now know to ask, to making all the choices we now know are there to be made. They need to understand that to revive means engaging with a piece not only in its context, but in ours. That the life that a revival breathes into an old play can have only one source: the present. Making space for diversity on and off stage, and bringing in new creative voices from all manner of experiences and backgrounds is only part of that. But it's a good place to start. Oh, and hire a fucking dramaturg, please. Jesus Christ, you people. Hi, thanks for watching. I'm Harlan, by the way. Nice to say that. Thanks for making it to the end. I mean, I barely made it to the end, so... No, seriously, this took like an embarrassingly long time. So when I say subscribe to the channel, I mean like if you don't subscribe to the channel, you might forget I exist before I put out another video. So if you liked this, subscribe. Yeah, so that is it, I guess. Check out my work if you're interested. Anyway, bye! Ugh, I thought they'd never leave.